It started with small annoyances, the kind every landowner with an HOA hovering nearby knows too well. A misplaced trash can, a letter about fence colors, a warning about grass height. But then came something entirely different, something that made me question whether Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had finally lost touch with reality. I owned a large stretch of land on the edge of the neighborhood, a mix of pasture, oak trees, and rolling fields. It was quiet land, the kind of place that gave me peace after long days. But to Karen, it was wasted space, as she'd once sneered at an HOA meeting. She believed everything needed to save the community as she defined it, and in her twisted imagination, that included turning my property into her playground. The first sign of trouble came late on a Friday evening. I returned home to find strange cars parked along the road that bordered my land. At first, I thought it was spillover from some neighbor's party. But then I saw tents being pitched near the tree line, campfires flickering, and voices carrying in the night. By the time I drove closer, my headlights swept over what looked like a small festival. Dozens of strangers had set up camp across my field as if it belonged to them. My confusion quickly turned to anger. These weren't just random trespassers. They were there by invitation, and not mine. Flyers taped to a few of the tents told a story. Community Campout, sponsored by the HOA. Open invitation. At the bottom, in bold print, Karen's name stood proudly as if she were mayor of the land. The sheer scale of it was shocking. By morning, there were nearly 500 people scattered across my acreage. Families unrolled sleeping bags on hay bales. Kids chased each other through the grass. Coolers were stacked in rows, grills smoked, and music blasted from portable speakers. They acted like it was a public park, not private property that had been bought and maintained with my hard-earned money. I walked the perimeter in disbelief, watching them stump through areas where my cattle normally grazed. Fence lines were broken in some places, posts knocked loose to let more cars roll in. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous. My bulls were kept in a separate pasture, heavy animals that didn't tolerate chaos. The intruders had no idea what kind of risk they were inviting onto themselves. At the center of it all, I finally spotted Karen. She sat in a folding chair under a canopy, sipping from a cup like a queen at her court. People came and went, thanking her for hosting. She waved them on with smug pride, as if she were the rightful owner of every acre under their feet. That night, as the campout grew louder and more reckless, I stayed awake inside my house, staring out into the darkness at the lights dotting my land. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. Karen had orchestrated a takeover, dragging in hundreds of people to trample on everything I'd built. I knew something had to be done. And as the noise from the crowd carried deep into the early hours, I began to think about the most effective way to remind them whose land they were on. By sunrise, the scene on my land had grown into something almost surreal. Smoke from grills hung in the air, mingled with a sharp smell of burnt wood from makeshift fires scattered across the pasture. The noise was constant. Children yelling, dogs barking, adults laughing loudly like they were at a music festival. Beer cans and plastic cups littered the grass. It was no longer just a campout. It was chaos. I stepped outside with a morning light and scanned the property. My once quiet ranch looked like a county fairground. Cars were parked haphazardly in rows, some with their tires digging into the soil. More people streamed in, carrying tents, food coolers, and even portable speakers. It was clear now that Karen hadn't simply invited the neighborhood. She had turned my land into a stage, advertising it far and wide without my knowledge. I thought about calling the police immediately, but then I saw the scale of it. Hundreds of people, too many for a quick resolution. Besides, the local officers had bigger problems than a trespassing campout. And I knew Karen. She would twist the story, paint me as the unreasonable one, and drown them in her HOA rulebook that she wielded like a weapon. Instead, I took a slow drive along the fence line in my truck. My cattle were clustered in their pasture, uneasy from all the commotion. The bulls in particular paced the edges, snorting and pawing at the ground. They could sense the intrusion. They didn't like the sound of strangers stomping so close to their space. A plan started to form in the back of my mind, one that would give Karen and her guests a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. By mid-morning, the campout hit full swing. Music pounded from portable speakers, and people set up volleyball nets right in the middle of my grazing field. A group even dragged a large log from the tree line to build an oversized bonfire pit. The land was being torn apart in front of me, and Karen still sat like a queen under her canopy, smiling smugly whenever she caught me watching. I made my way closer to her gathering, just to see if anyone realized how wrong this was. What I saw only fueled my resolve. Strangers trampled my grass, dumped trash wherever they pleased, and even let their dogs run loose near the fence. One of the dogs barked at my bulls, sending them into an agitated frenzy. I watched as they stomped and bellowed, their heavy frames pressing against the reinforced fencing. It was only a matter of time before something gave. Karen, of course, was blind to the danger. She waved her arms dramatically, telling groups where to pitch more tents, bragging about how the HOA had expanded the community experience. To her, this was some sort of crowning achievement. To me, it was trespass on a scale I'd never seen. That evening, as the sun began to set and the campout showed no sign of slowing down, I knew the moment of warning had passed. They weren't going to leave quietly, and Karen certainly wasn't going to admit she was in the wrong. From my porch, I looked across the property to where the bulls stood restless, their muscles rippling under the fading light. They were powerful, unpredictable animals, and they didn't take kindly to intruders. The trespassers had ignored every unspoken warning the land and its owner had given them. It was time for the land, and its rightful residents, to issue a warning of their own. The night descended with the camp still in full swing. Flashlights darted through the fields, fires burned high, and music thundered as if my pasture had been converted into a festival ground. I sat on my porch in the shadows, waiting. The bulls were restless, their heavy hooves striking the date, their low grumbles echoing through the darkness. They had been patient far longer than the intruders deserved. Karen's guests were oblivious. They danced, shouted, and stumbled across the grass with no sense of the danger surrounding them. The broken fence that had been forced open early in the day now hung wide, its posts leaning precariously. Beyond it, my bulls pressed close, snorting clouds of steam in the cool night air. Their eyes glowed under the lantern light. It didn't take much. A stray dog, emboldened by the chaos, slipped past the bonfire crowd and darted straight toward the pasture. Its barking carried across the night, sharp and provoking. The bulls had tolerated noise all day, but the barking was a final spark. With a thunderous crack, one of them surged forward, splintering the weakened fence in an explosion of wood and wire. The ground shook as the bulls charged into the open field. Their massive bodies plowed through the grass, horns gleaming in the firelight. The crowd's laughter turned instantly to screams. Tents collapsed as people scattered in every direction, scrambling for safety as the bulls stormed through their makeshift camp. Coolers tipped, grills flipped, and cars were abandoned where they sat today. From my porch, I watched the chaos unfold. It wasn't malice that drove the bulls forward. It was instinct. They didn't understand what a campout was or why their pasture had been invaded. They only knew that their space had been violated, and they reclaimed it with force. The party dissolved in seconds, replaced with the sounds of panic, shouts for help, and the thundering hooves of animals who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. And then there was Karen. She had stood her ground at first, waving her arms and barking orders as if she could control the stampede like she controlled her HOA meetings. But the bulls didn't bow to her authority. One snort, one charge in her direction, and the smug look was wiped clean. She bolted from her canopy, stumbling across the field in a desperate attempt to reach the road. Her throne had fallen, and with it, every ounce of her imagined control. By the time the police arrived, summoned by frantic calls from the fleeing campers, the damage was done. The camp was in ruins. People sat dazed near the road, some clutching torn tents or broken coolers, others just staring back at the field in disbelief. The officers took one look at the scene and understood immediately what had happened. Karen tried to spin her story, but the truth was too obvious. Hundreds had trespassed on private land, destroying fences, property, and peace. The officers noted the damage, nodded at me with respect, and then turned their attention to Karen. She wasn't the victim she pretended to be. She was the instigator. And now, in front of everyone she had tried to impress, she was being held accountable. The bulls, now calm again, were herded back into their pasture. The field, though scarred, stood silent once more. The uninvited guests had fled, their camping gear abandoned, their pride shattered. For me, there was no triumphal cheer, no gloating speech, only quiet satisfaction. The land had defended itself, and Karen had learned, in the most unforgettable way, that some boundaries aren't hazed across. Do like, subscribe, do you like this story? Tell comments.